Yes.
So I see that it's 2 o'clock and starting time. And thank you very much for all coming. So many of you have come to the whole series, and it's very good to see familiar faces again. And thank you, Bill Brown, for setting up this series. This is the 7th year we've been doing it together, Bill and David and me, and it's been a lot of stimulation from the time the Nobels were announced on October the 8th. Our lives changed quite dramatically. Depending on who the prize winners are, the dinner conversation can either be upbeat or downright depressing. And this year, David's and my dinner time conversation was perhaps in the latter category because we revolved around why nations fail, the atomic bomb, and how can we reconcile ourselves to a world filled with so much human violence, and the saving grace was, and beauty. So last night was the big wrap-up ceremony in Sweden of the Nobel Awards. And it's held every year on December the 10th, which was the anniversary of Alfred Nobel's death. He died young. He was only 63, and he packed an enormous amount in. He was primarily a scientist and an inventor, and made 355 inventions, including dynamite. And somebody said, well, did he set aside the money for the Nobel Prizes out of guilt? Well, I like to think that it wasn't out of guilt. He had a very good personal friend who was very, very committed to peace, and she was a big influence in his life. But when it came to the Nobel Literature Prize, this was really close to his heart, because Nobel himself was a writer. He wrote poetry, he wrote several novels, one of them being about creating a more beautiful place for suicides. He was also deeply concerned with justice, and he once said, Madam Justice has paralysis of the legs and has always been terribly slow. He idolized Victor Hugo. In fact, part of his life was spent in Paris, and he happened to live just down the road from Victor Hugo. And he sent Victor Hugo an 83rd birthday card saying, Great Master, thank you for your charm and your concern with universal charity. Nobel had an extensive library of about 1,500 volumes. He spoke 7 languages. He loved poets, especially Byron, which is interesting. And I think the Literature Prize reflects this very much because it's an award given for outstanding work in literature of an idealistic nature which adds the most to mankind, which benefits mankind most. Now, there have been 109 awards so far. Sorry, it started in 1901. There have been 116 awards, and only 18 of these have been awarded to women, including Pearl Buck, The Good Earth, Nadine Gordimer, South African, wonderful writing, including Canadian Alice Munro in 2013. And interestingly, since Bill and David and I started doing this series in 2019, I believe it was, we've had 4 women. The first one was the Polish woman, Olga Tokarczuk. And I've noticed that if there's a pattern to the Nobel winners, it's that each winner reflects the concerns of that moment. Now, Poland has had borders which have continually been changed. And so Tokarczuk's book Flights is about borders. It's about moving between countries, identifying borders, airports, travel. Then came Louise Gluck, the American poet who talked about her abortion. It was one of the first writers, she was one of the first contemporary writers to write about abortion very clearly. And she also explored relationship conflicts, tensions, and beauties, which are familiar to us all. Then we had Annie Ernaux, the French writer, for her relentlessly honest confessional writing and her description of her abortion when it was illegal in France. Very powerful writing. How do you choose a Nobel Prize in Literature? Well, all of the recipients have had other literary awards, frequently the Man Booker, the big international award, and recently the International Man Booker Award. In addition, most of the writers have regional prizes, and so there's a whole body of work. It's rarely awarded to a book, it's really the lifetime of writing. The youngest writer to receive an award was Rudyard Kipling. He was only 41, and there have been many in their 70s and 80s. The judges start with about 200 submissions, and they narrow it down to 20, and then over the summer, they narrow it down to 5, and they each try to read each of the works 5 times. Now, I've read them twice since October the 8th. That's a huge, reading them all is a huge job. This year's award winner is the South Korean writer, Hong Kong, and she is a young writer by Nobel standards. She was born on November the 27th, 1970, which makes her just a few weeks ago 54. She grew up in a literary family. Her father is an avant-garde poet and novelist. She was married, she'd been divorced for quite a long time, but she was married to a literary critic and professor. That would be difficult at the dinner table, I would imagine. And her whole life revolved around literature. Now, when we come to a body of work, I'm always fascinated by the writer, the life of the writer. In fact, when I was a little girl, I read the complete works of Enid Blyton, and when I grew up, I was going to be Enid Blyton. Well, I think I had as many dogs, but other than that. There are experiences in our lives which stand out, and some of them are traumatic. And when Han Kang was a little girl, age 9, she was living in one of the southernmost Korean towns, Gwangju. And when she was 9 years old, going on 10, in the middle of the night, 2 men came to the family house. She had a traditional family neighborhood, and her mother told them to go into the living room, and the 2 men went through wardrobes and closets and drawers and pulled everything apart. And her mother explained it to her, saying, well, they're from the real estate company. They think you're buying the house. Well, we could go down the road with that one, but we're not going to. Very shortly after, the family left Gwangju, as it turned out 4 months before the Gwangju massacre, and they moved to Seoul. And when she was 11 years old, her family would often sit in the kitchen when she and her brothers were not around, and they'd talk in hushed voices. And there was a big book that was put on the table, and they were looking at photographs in that book. And whenever they saw her, they'd close the book and hide it. When she was 11, she climbed onto a chair went up to the top of the cupboard where they had hidden it and brought out a book. It was a book of photographs, and when she opened it, there was a photograph of a young woman with her face slashed from cheek to breast by a knife or a bayonet. And these were the survivors of the Guangzhou massacre, which under martial law, the media had been forced to be suppressed. That experience at 11 created a violence in Hong Kong's life. And it came out as nightmares. Now, it wasn't until much, much later that the Hong Kong material would surface, as it did eventually. It came out, interestingly, in her early poetry. Her first publications were in a South Korean magazine, and they were poems. And the question which obsessed her was, how can we be so violent? And how can life be so beautiful? How can these extremes coexist? She went on to write short stories and then some short novels. She wrote a book called The White Book, which was autobiographical fiction, and this examines and plays with, if we can use that word, the experience of her mother and her sister who lived just 2 hours after birth. She also wrote a book called Greek Lessons, very short book, only 160 pages, about a young woman, a mother, who becomes mute, who has a history of traumatic experience in her home, and she takes Greek lessons from her professor, who is older and going blind. And it's a very moving story of the two characters. Then, between 2003 and 2005, she wrote what came to be a big book, The Vegetarian. And it was through this book that some of the violence began to surface. And I'm going to do some selected readings. This book is certainly postmodern fiction. It's metafiction, where there is a switching from narrator to narrator. Time is very fluid, and the voices switch from first person to third person to second person and so on. And there's a lot of experimental dream work in the book. I've avoided reading the most brutal parts of this book. I don't think it was necessary, so I'm going to skirt around them as much as possible. So The Vegetarian, translated by Deborah Smith. And The Vegetarian was selected in 2014 for the Man Booker International Award. And she was given this year's award for intense personal prose that confronts historical trauma and explores the fragility of human life. Hong Kong started with one image before she wrote The Vegetarian. It was the image of a woman turning into a plant. In this book, she says that electing not to eat meat is a refusal of violence. But she did point out in an interview that in Korea today, one can be a vegetarian without attracting much attention because there are meat and vegetables served in most meals, so that if you're a vegetarian, you just don't eat the meat. But for the purposes of this book, where meat eating represents violence, it becomes a much more polarized experience. It has three narrations. The first is the husband of the woman Yong-hae. The second is the husband of her sister, and the third is the sister. and originally it was written as 3 short stories. Before my wife turned vegetarian, I'd always thought of her as completely unremarkable in every way. Middling height, bobbed hair, neither long nor short, jaundiced, sickly-looking skin, somewhat prominent cheekbones. Her timid, sallow aspect told me all I needed to know. However, if there wasn't any special attraction, nor did any particular drawbacks present themselves, and therefore there was no reason for the 2 of us not to get married. In keeping with my expectations, she made for a completely ordinary wife. Now, as it turns out, she was not a completely ordinary wife because she had nightmares. Her nightmares and visions are written in italics. Never at any point in the book do we have her direct input. So here's the first nightmare of the unremarkable wife, the dutiful wife. Dark woods, no people. The sharp pointed leaves on the trees, my torn feet. This place, almost remembered, but I'm lost now, frightened, cold. Across the frozen ravine, a red barn-like building. I'm inside. A long bamboo stick strung with great blood-red gashes of meat. Blood still dripping down. There's no end to the meat and no exit. Blood in my mouth, blood-soaked clothes stuck onto my skin. The fear, hide behind the trees. My bloody hands, my bloody mouth. In that barn, what had I done? Pushed that red, raw mass into my mouth, felt it squish against my gums, the roof of my mouth slick with crimson blood. Time passes. Even though I've stopped wearing a bra, I can feel this lump all the time. No matter how deeply I inhale, it doesn't go away. Yells and howls, threaded together layer upon layer, are enmeshed to form that lump because of meat. I ate too much meat. The lives of the animals I ate have all lodged there, blood and flesh. All those butchered bodies are scattered in every nook and cranny. And though the physical remnants are excreted, their lives still stick stubbornly to my insides. I want to throw myself through the pitch black window. At first, young Hay's choice to become a vegetarian is simply an irritation to her dutiful husband. Then it becomes a little more. It becomes an inconvenience and an embarrassment. In this next scene, the couple go to her parents for a family dinner, and in the society of 2003 or so, the father, the great father, was the patriarch and to be obeyed. When young Hay refuses meat, he becomes angry. He puts together chopsticks full of pork and shoves them at her. This is the voice of the husband, the narration. With one hand, my wife pushed away his chopsticks of pork. Father, I don't eat meat. In an instant, his flat palm cleaved the empty space. My wife cupped her cheek in her hand. He'd hit her so hard that the blood showed through the skin of her cheek. He now picked up a piece of pork with his fingers. If she eats it once, she'll eat it again. It's preposterous. Everyone eats meat. He strengthened his grip on my wife. He mashed the pork into a pulp on my wife's lips as she struggled in agony. Though he parted her lips with his strong fingers, he could do nothing about her clenched teeth. Eventually, he flew into a passion again, struck her in the face once more. The force of the slap had knocked her mouth open. He'd managed to jam the pork in. An animal cry of distress burst from her lips. She spat out the meat. "Get away!" At first, she drew up her shoulders and seemed about to flee in the direction of the front door. But then she turned back and picked up the fruit knife that had been lying on the dining table. Blood ribboned out of her wrist. The shock of red splashed over white china. She cuts to a memory then that is clearly the reason that she gave up meat. And like all memories, these are layered. Sometimes it takes an experience to reveal a memory that we've suppressed for many, many years. And this next memory, which I will not read because it is too brutal, was for me the key to the book. When she was 9 years old, the family dog, a large white dog, nipped her on the calf, and they condemned the dog to death. They had the 9-year-old girl stand and watch while they chained the dog to her father's motorcycle and drove it round and round and round and round and round and round and round until the dog died. Then they ate the dog. Now, eating dog has been something in Korean society, but it was banned. It was recently banned until 2027. There are still approximately 3,000 dog farms, and they say, well, you eat pig, no, we eat dog. Well, we could debate that, but we're not going to. The character, Yong-hae, is taken to a psychiatric hospital, and when she is released, she still won't eat meat, and her husband leaves her, and she moves into a small apartment where she lives on fruit and cereal, and she wants to become a plant. Her sister's husband, a very interesting character, is a freelance artist who makes artistic videos. There's a very interesting little tongue-in-cheek section in the book. The husband permits his wife to support him and look after their child and take care of the housework. She has a cosmetic industry, and every day he goes off to his studio and dabbles with his videos. Well, he has a little obsession. While Yong-hae's husband found her unremarkable, her brother-in-law finds her alluring because she has a Mongolian birthmark, which is a small bluish mark on her left buttock. And he finds this enormously erotic. And so he wants to make a video, and what he wants to make is the image of a man and a woman, their bodies made brilliant with painted flowers, having sex against a background of unutterable silence, a progression of scenes lurching from violence to tenderness. "Take off your clothes," he said in a low voice. She was standing, staring blankly at the white poplars outside the window. The afternoon sun shone desolate on the white sheet. "Lie on your stomach," he told her. He fixed the camcorder to the tripod and adjusted it. First, he swept up the hair that was falling over her shoulders, and then, starting from the nape of her neck, he began to paint. Half-opened buds, red and orange, bloomed splendidly on her shoulders and back, and slender stems twined down her ribs. When he reached the hump of her right buttock, he painted an orange flower in full bloom with a thick, vivid yellow pistil protruding from its center. He left the left buttock, the one with the Mongolian mark, undecorated. Instead, he just used a large brush to cover the area around the bluish mark with a wash of light green. After they have sex, he realized what it was that had shocked him when he'd first seen her lying prone on the sheet. This was the body of a beautiful young woman, conventionally an object of desire, and yet it was a body from which all desire had been eliminated. But this was nothing so crass as carnal desire, not for her, rather, or so it seemed. What she had renounced was the very life that her body represented. The sunlight that came splintering through the wide window, dissolving into grains of sand, and the beauty of that body, which, though this was not visible to the eye, was also ceaselessly splintering. When he comes again, she says, "I didn't wash. I didn't want the flowers to come off. They're stopping the dreams from coming. If they come off, I want you to paint it again." Now, into this rather innocent frolic with painted flowers comes the artist's wife. And one can see why she's pissed off. She's supporting this guy. You know, she's looking after the kid, she's at home babysitting, and he's out there having fun with her sister. So she calls the local psychiatric hospital, and they come with their straitjackets and bundle the flower-bedecked couple into straitjackets and off to the psychiatric hospital. He is released. She never leaves the psychiatric hospital. And she is force-fed and then IV-fed, and right at the end, and these scenes are too violent, we do not need to read them, but she's force-fed, and at the end, the nasogastric tube is inserted and causes severe hemorrhage in the stomach. And an ambulance is called, and she is rushed to hospital, but already she is leaving. And it's ironic, one of the ironies of the book is that for an unremarkable woman, this is a very determined, resolute character who will do anything to maintain her life as a plant. At the end, there are some beautiful descriptions of nature. The only beauty in the book really comes when the author talks about nature. This third section is from the point of view of the sister. And our character, who has descended into a madness at this point, says, "Trees actually stand with both arms in the earth, all of them. They're all standing on their heads." She laughed frantically. "Do you know how I found out? Well, I was in a dream. I was standing on my head. Leaves were growing from my body, and roots were sprouting from my hands. I wanted flowers to bloom from my crotch, so I spread them wide. I don't need to eat, not now. I need water and sunlight." Her sister says, "What are you talking about? Do you really think you've turned into a tree? How could a plant talk? How can you think these things?" Young-Hae's eyes shone. A mysterious smile played on her face. "You're right. Soon now, words and thoughts will disappear, soon." She burst into laughter, then sighed, "Very soon. Just a bit longer to wait, sister." While the ambulance is being called, the sister goes back over her childhood and realizes that Young-Hae, the vegetarian, was beaten by their father frequently, while she was not beaten. And if we look for memory, the incident with the dog, the beating, in order to save her own life, the only way that this young woman could rebel was the way she did. And at the end, the ambulance is rushing her to hospital, but she is right on the brink of passing from this world. The ambulance is rounding the last bend in the road. The sister sees a black bird flying up towards the dark clouds. The summer sunlight dazzles her eyes, makes them sting, and her gaze cannot follow the bird's flight anymore. Quietly she breathes in. The trees by the side of the road are blazing, green fire undulating like rippling flanks of a massive animal, wild and savage. She stares fiercely at the trees, as if waiting for an answer, as if protesting against something. And if we look at Hong Kong and the history of her writing, there was a reaching out, a need to protest at this point. Well, that didn't come until 2 or 3 years later, when her nightmares returned. And at that point, she decided to write about the Kwangju massacre that had happened just 4 months after her family fled Kwangju. And she happened, through research, to find a book which had been put together by the relatives and by the survivors of the massacre, 900 accounts. And so Hong Kong holed up and worked 9 hours a day reading these horrible accounts for several months, and then wrote the book Human Acts. Now, the Kwangju massacre occurred on May the 18th, 1980, when President Park had been a military dictator since 1961. And he'd started off an elected president, but as his rule went on, he actually changed the constitution to make him a de facto dictator. And under the dictator, the economy of South Korea improved. Many factories grew up, industrialization occurred, but the workers were working under shocking conditions, long hours, and they were not happy. Now, he was murdered 4 months before May the 18th by the head of his private military service. And the new person brought in martial law. Now, martial law closes universities, it closes down the press, it forbids all political activities. And on May the 18th, hundreds, thousands of people, the exact number is not known because this was suppressed until 1989 in the press, turned out peacefully in front of the equivalent to City Hall. And there were students, and there were children, and there were workers, there were factory girls who earned shockingly low salaries, who worked in appalling conditions. It was a peaceful demonstration. And then paratroopers, the military were called in, and the people were bludgeoned with clubs, slashed with bayonets, and shot with guns. And the book starts, interestingly, with the bodies. Many of the bodies were never found because they were just taken out into the thickets outside the town, piled into a tower, and then burned. So we're going to start with the body of a young man who had been trying to find his 15-year-old friend. The grasshoppers were chirring. Hidden birds began to trill their morning song. Gusts of wind grazed the leaves of dark trees. The pale sun trembled over the lip of the horizon, moving up to the sky's center in a violent, majestic advance. Piled up behind the thicket, our bodies now began to soften in the sun, with putrefaction setting in. Clouds of gadflies and mayflies alighted in those places that were clogged with the dried black blood, rubbed their front legs, crawled about, flew up, then settled again. It frightened me to think that here in this strange thicket, surrounded by bodies gradually breaking down into their constituent parts, I was alone among strangers. In an attempt to batten down the rising tide of fear, I thought of my sister, and I felt an agony that almost broke me. I knew she was dead. With neither tongue nor voice to carry it, my scream leaked out from me in a mess of blood and watery discharge. I had to cling to, I had to conjure up every little sensation of my last night with my sister when I still had a body. The grasshoppers in the yard, their faint, almost soundless cries. The hollyhocks that towered up in front of our house. The wild roses blooming in a gaudy, blousy riot of colour against the breeze-block wall opposite your room. My face, which my sister had once caressed, my stilled, unseeing face, which she had loved. The sound of an engine rumbled closer. They carried the latest batch of bodies, 4 whose skulls had been caved in by some blunt weapon, leaving a splatter pattern on their upper bodies. 3 men and a woman. Thin, watery blood was still trickling from their clothes. I was filled with hatred for my body, our bodies, tossed like lumps of meat, our filthy, rotting faces reeking in the sun. On one occasion, the bodies of 10 people they'd just piled up seemed to be missing their heads. I thought they'd been decapitated. Then I realized that, in fact, their faces had been covered in white paint, erased. Had those bodies been there alongside me at the demonstration, jostling my elbow, part of that vast mass of humanity whose voices surged as one, I grasped your hand, sister, and tugged you forward towards the head of the column while you muttered to yourself in blank incomprehension, "Our soldiers are shooting. They're shooting at us." I pulled you towards them with all my strength, opening my throat to sing while you seemed on the point of tears. I sang along with the national anthem, my heart fit to burst. Before they sent that white-hot bullet driving into my side, before those faces were cancelled out, expunged with white paint. Now, 10 years later, 1990, a young man is being interviewed by a professor who is writing his thesis on the Guangzhou uprising. And this young man was 15 at the time, and he and a group of boys had guns, but they were unable to bring themselves to shoot when the soldiers came into the school. They were captured, and for 5 months they were subjected to the most appalling tortures, which once again we are not going to go into. He remembers that his life was totally destroyed when he was let out. Some of his friends had committed suicide. He never went back to get an education. He lived at home with his parents, and he took many, many different kinds of painkillers and was stalked by nightmares, the trauma of torture. He says of the actual demonstration, "It wasn't as though we didn't know how overwhelmingly the army outnumbered us. But the strange thing was it didn't matter. Ever since the uprising began, I'd felt something coursing through me as overwhelming as any army: conscience. The day I stood shoulder to shoulder with hundreds of thousands of my fellow citizens, staring down the barrels of the soldiers' guns, I was startled to discover the absence inside myself, the absence of fear. I remember feeling that it was all right to die. I felt the blood of 100,000 hearts singing, but when the bullets came flying, I turned and ran. the sublime feeling that I'd been tapping into, that enormous heart I felt briefly a part of, was smashed to pieces, strewn over the ground as so much rubbish. Beside me and in front of me, people crumpled to the ground, but I kept on running. I once met a paratrooper. He said that they'd been ordered to suppress the civilians with as much violence as possible, and those who committed especially brutal actions were awarded hundreds of thousands of won by their superiors. They give you money and tell you to beat someone up. Well, why wouldn't you? How is it that a face can so effectively conceal what lies behind? How is it not indelibly marked by such callousness, brutality, murderousness? Is it true that human beings are fundamentally cruel? Is the experience of cruelty the only thing we share as a species? Is the dignity that we cling to nothing but self-delusion, masking from ourselves the single truth that each of us is capable of being reduced to a ravening beast, a lump of meat, to be degraded, damaged, slaughtered? Is this the essential fate of humanity, one which history has confirmed as inevitable? It is as though it is imprinted in our genetic code. Now, the author tries to sum up in a final chapter. Though there were some soldiers who were especially cruel, so there were others who were especially non-aggressive. There were paratroopers who carried the wounded on their backs all the way to the hospital. And when the order was given to fire into the crowd, they fired above into the air. About halfway through studying these books, I decided I had had enough. I came to the library and I took out the biography of Mr. Rogers. And I felt it's such a relief that it was a beautiful day in the neighborhood. And on one occasion, Mr. Rogers remembers when he was a little boy and his mother said to him, "Sometimes you'll see very upsetting things on TV, you'll hear horrible things in the news. Always remember that there are helpers. There are always the helpers, and you must think about the helpers." Well, in Guangzhou, there was a long line of people outside the hospital, day and night, to donate blood to those who were injured. The final episode in the book features the mother of a 15-year-old boy who was murdered in the uprising and the body never found. And somebody once said to her, "You couldn't have a funeral." And she said, this is 30 years later, she said, "My life is a funeral." The last little part of the book is the part that I choose to focus on. She's remembering and talking to the son that she's lost, and she says, "When you were 6 or 7, you disliked the shadowed places where the trees blocked out the sun. 'Let's walk over there, Mum, where it's sunny. We might as well, right? There's lots of flowers too.' 'Why are we walking in the dark? Let's go over there where the flowers are blooming.'" Now, Hong Kong, in an interview, said that she started off writing the book, how can the living help the dead, or can the living help the dead? Can the present help the past? And she decided that yes, by giving dignity and giving names and faces to these expunged corpses, that was possible. But she also decided that the past can help the present and the dead can help the living. And last week, we were glued to the television about what was going on in South Korea. And President Yoon, supposedly the president of a strong democracy now, because as South Korea moved from the 90s into the 2000s, it became a democracy. President Yoon, two parties, the Democratic Party and the People's Power Party, announced one way or another that North Koreans and communism were infiltrating South Korea. That was the reason that President Park in 1961 declared martial law, under the excuse that communists were infiltrating the system, hence martial law. Yoon last week declared the same thing, called in paratroopers, called in the military, but Han Young's book has sold millions. It is a top bestseller in South Korea, and 4 hours after the paratroopers started to arrive, thousands and thousands of South Koreans, particularly young people who had read Hong Kong's book, were on the street. They're still on the streets. And one of the young women, you probably saw this on TV, went up to one of the soldiers and stared down the barrel of his rifle and said, "Aren't you ashamed of yourself?" Knowing that all of this had happened in the previous massacre. Well, the martial law, Yoon called off the martial law, and I heard that just yesterday he has been arrested. He is not permitted to leave the country. We don't have news of his impeachment, but I think this answers the question, is the pen sometimes mightier than the sword? And we still have, we have some time to look at this and see what's going to happen in South Korea, because as we know these days, things can change in a 24-hour period. Is the human race violent? Is it beautiful? How do we exist with these two extremes? Well, there are fires threatening the homes in Malibu. You've seen this in the news. And remember Dick Van Dyke, Mary Poppins, the chimney sweep, chimney, chimney, tum, tum, tum. Well, Dick Van Dyke was evacuated yesterday from his home in Malibu. He's 98. He participated in a little dance routine recently, barefoot. And I'm going to give him the last word today. He said, "As long as there is one voice left to say welcome to a stranger, one hand outstretched to say enter and share, and one mind remaining to think a thought of warmth and friendship, then there is still hope for humanity." Thank you.
Oh, that's
Now, are there any comments, questions, or anything else? Or are you like I, gobsmacked? It's powerful, powerful stuff. She does have, Hong Kong does have a new book coming out in 2025, and it's not going to be a walk in the park either. It's about a massacre on the island of Jeju. Who knows where her quest will take her, but it's very interesting, tracing through her life and the life of her writing. Thank you. Yes, David.
With the vegetarian, you said, was that the autobiographical fiction or was it something else?
No, it's pure fiction.
That's pure fiction.
It's pure fiction, but I've often wondered, apart from crime writing, is there such a thing as fiction? You know, as a novelist, I know that my first novel was thinly disguised autobiography. Colette's first novel, thinly disguised autobiography. Proust, all of the writers. Victor Hugo, well, he wasn't a miserable, but we're influenced by our own lives, by the people around us, by the traumas and joys in our lives. So, but autobiographical fiction was the prize winner before Jon Fosse, the Norwegian. The year before that, Annie Ernaux, the French winner, wrote autobiographical fiction of episodes in her own life, but fictionalized. And just because we have a story to tell doesn't mean that it's going to be good fiction. So autobiographical fiction takes the truth and plays with it, modifies it, and so on. But Han Kang's is not autobiographical fiction. It's influenced by the traumas and experiences, but it's not the story of her life. The Guangzhou massacre, Human Acts, is the closest I think I've seen a book come to an actual, it's not a historical romance, but it's certainly influenced by the facts. And reading those 900 accounts, there's nothing in this book that wasn't sourced in terms of the appalling things that happened, wasn't sourced in those 900 accounts. Yes, Daphne?
The recent military declaration of military law in South Korea seems to parallel this.
Yes, very much. And because it paralleled it so much, and without Hong Kong's book, very few people would have known about the Guangzhou massacre, because the media was suppressed and people just didn't know, and they still don't know how many people were killed. There are still bones and bodies being dug up. But because of the Book of Survivors and because of the testaments of the 900, but yes, the parallels. We have somebody who was elected, who diddled with the Constitution and became himself a de facto dictator, who used the rumor, the excuse that there was communist and North Korean infiltration to bring in martial law to suppress the communistic elements, total parallel. And then you bring in the paratroopers, the military, and they were I thought that they were very, they acted immediately. Because once you have the military in, it's just a matter of moments, hours before brutality starts, whether it's the police suppressing young people in the 60s in a park in Chicago, or whether it's South Korea. They had to get out there, and the Democratic Party called for action, and in the middle of the night there were young people gathering, thousands of them, and they had read Hong Kong's book. They knew about the Guangzhou massacre. They knew that they had to get out now before the brutality of martial law took over. And Yun, of course, was very surprised. Nobody had anticipated this, that the people actually could rebel against this and could turn the tide of history. And there are so many parallels in today's world. We won't go there, but we can see how a politician is legally elected. There's a constitution, there's a parliament, two parties, and then you change the constitution a little bit, and then you declare there's an emergency on the streets, whether it's North Korean communistic influences, whether it's violent immigrants, whatever. You declare an emergency, you bring in martial law, you suppress the press, the media, you suppress universities, the hotbed of intellectual inquiry, and you ban all political activities. And from then on, it's plain sailing as a dictator, until you're overthrown, as Assad has been.
If there is still intellectual activity in the universities, which is debatable at this point, it sounds as though Korea was not necessarily a true democracy from the time that it was declared a democracy.
Right.
And were there other instances?
The South Korea has been a very troubled political scene before Park took over in 1961. He was elected, but it wasn't a true democracy. And then into the 90s, there was another uprising in the 90s, and then up to 2000, Park's daughter in the 2000s was elected, and there's been a lot of push and pull. The South Koreans, up until Yoon, have been very proud of their democracy and their democratic principles, and hopefully it will go on that way. But it's been a troubled democracy at best.
I'd like to carry on a little bit with what you'd said, with universities being the hotbed. I've often wondered in the past, even in Canada, when you have a group get together, who's actually controlling these people though? And I think it's even possible in universities. They have to clamp down perhaps on, it sounds to me that there wasn't communist infiltrators even in the universities to rile the people up, as they have had in the past here in Canada. I think that's most important to realize who's controlling these mobs. And in that particular case, it was the right people.
Yes, with universities and with uprisings everywhere, especially, well, an example of Montreal. There was a demonstration in Montreal, and we were living there, and it was a peaceful demonstration. It was demonstrating against something perfectly reasonable, and thugs broke in and broke the shop windows, and from what I've read, whenever there's a demonstration, it's an opportunity for violence from people who have nothing to do with the outside, because by and large, students are generally, no, there of course are exceptions, but generally fairly restrained and fairly non-violent. But you trigger it with one instance of violence and it's a powder keg waiting to happen.
Yes,
who controls it? It seems that there are people who come in and take advantage of violence to make political statements. With the demonstrations of the anti-Palestine, the anti-cruelty in Gaza and violence and so on. It was a very well-ordered demonstration in many universities, but it's the ones that have the violence who get the publicity, and then universities per se get a very bad reputation, and it can affect the university presidents, and it also affects the future of our universities.
Yes.
You know, because education is supposed to question. The university is the bed of democracy, of freedom of speech. If we don't feel passionate about political events when we're 18, when are we going to? How many of you here have ever taken part in any sort of university or demonstration, a peaceful demonstration? David and I, when we organised the Montreal Childbirth Education Association, the government wanted to close the first and only family-centred hospital in town, the Catherine Booth Hospital, which we had worked very hard to get fathers present at the birth in. And so we organised a pramathon. Now, what is a pramathon, you might ask? It is about 100 fathers on a Sunday morning with their babies in the prams, pushing down Sherlock Street. And the minister at that point was Claude Castonguay. And the men walked down pushing the pram saying, "Hey, hey, Castonguay, we want babies our way." It got a lot of press coverage, but that was the demonstration that we participated in.
Tell me, I was just thinking, Korea's had a long history of brutality, that long period of Japanese occupation, and even before that, and certainly in the war, 1950-53, any UN soldiers that were captured far preferred to be captured by the Chinese than Koreans, both sides. South and North. So
Because?
Brutality.
Because?
I don't know, but there's this long history. I mean, it's at least 150 years old of brutal government throughout Korea. And it would be wrong to think it was just North Korea, it was South Korea as well. And the US tolerated a lot of this.
Well,
maybe not fostered it, but
tolerated, yes. Also during the war in Vietnam, Korea was the one of the biggest allies of the US. And there's one account that I read from the 900 accounts where one soldier said it was very easy, a paratrooper said it was very easy to become brutal because when we were in Vietnam, we rounded up the men, women, we rounded up all the villagers, the women and children, put them in a building and burned it to the ground. It was very easy to become brutal when you've done something like that. And such are the rules of war.
Yeah,
There are
sounds like-
no rules.
yeah.
There are no rules
There are no
anymore.
rules anymore, no.
It's an oxymoron.
Precisely. Well, it's moronic anyway. But there we are. Thank you all for coming. And once again, thank you, Bill. Thank you, David. And we'll look forward to next year's series.
Thank you. The best closer we've got.